Today's daf is Chulin daf Tzadik Daled, and we are at the Mishnah, 3 lines from the bottom of daf Tzadik Gimel Amid Beis. More halacha is related to the Gid Hanash. Says the Mishnah, Sheileach Adam Yerech La'ovid Koichavin. A person is allowed to give or sell a thigh to a non-Jew, shegid hanasha b'saycha, despite the fact that the gid hanasha is in the thigh, because if you have a complete thigh, it's going to be obvious that the gid hanasha is inside. As a result, there's nothing to be concerned about, and there's no reason for the chachamim to prohibit giving the thigh of an animal that has a gid hanasha inside of it to a non-Jew. Now, what would be the thought that maybe there should be an issue to give the yerech with the gid hanasha inside of it to a non-Jew? There's no iser hana in the gid hanasha per se. The gid hanasha is aser b'achila, it's not aser b'hana. There's certain macholos asuros that are aser b'achila and aser b'hana. Chametz on Pesach, you can't eat, you also can't benefit from. Kilei hakerem is something that you're not allowed to eat, you also can't benefit from. But then there are isurei achila that are only aser b'achila, but there is no iser hana. For example, nevelis and treifas, you're not allowed to eat, but you can tell it to a guy, there's no iser hana. Gid hanasha is something that's aser b'achila, but there's no iser hana when it comes to gid hanasha. So there's nothing wrong per se to take your gid hanasha and give it to a non-Jew. Instead of throwing it out, you might as well sell it. You might as well get something from it. You just can't physically eat it, but you're allowed to benefit from it. Stating that, Chachamim thought that maybe there should be an issue. Because if you're going to give a piece of meat that has the gid hanasha inside of it to a non-Jew, maybe you need to be concerned that the non-Jew is going to turn around and he's going to give it or sell it to one of his Jewish friends. And if he's going to sell it with the gid hanasha inside of it, it's going to come out that you, by giving the gid hanasha, kosher meat with gid hanasha inside of it to the non-Jew, were indirectly machshel the yid that's going to end up buying it from the guy. So based on that, you would think that maybe it's not okay to take a thigh with the gid hanasha inside of it, give it to a non-Jew, lest he go ahead and sell it to a Jew. Stating that, the Mishnah says it's okay. And the reason is because being that we're discussing giving a complete thigh, so it would be nicker if the gid hanasha is there or not there. The process of removing the gid hanasha, what's called nicker, which we didn't really talk about yet, is a complex process, and it leaves a little bit of a mess behind. So whether the gid hanasha is in the yerech or not the yerech is very much identifiable. Thus, there's no michshel that's going to come from it, because if someone's going to buy this yerech from a non-Jew, he'll know whether the gid hanasha is there or not. There's no reason that you shouldn't be able to go ahead and give it. Stating that, the Gemara is going to immediately make a very obvious there. It sounds like the only time it's okay to give the yerech to the non-Jew is if Mekoyma is nicker, meaning you're giving him an entire yerech. So being that you have a nerech with the gid hanasha inside of it, so you'll know the gid hanasha is there. Because if you remove it, you're going to see the result of the nicker, as therefore you have nothing to worry about. There's no michshel that's going to come from it. It sounds, however, what if you took a piece of meat, you chopped it up, but you never removed the gid hanasha, where it won't be nicker. You don't have a complete yerech where you know if the gid hanasha is there or not there. But rather you have cut up pieces of meat. It sounds like in that case, it's not going to be good. And that's the Gemara's immediate dik. Shleima in chatucha. It sounds like the only time it's mutter to be shaleach yerech levi kechav and shkid hanasha b'saycha is if it's a yerech shleima. If, however, it's going to be chatucha, it sounds like it's not going to be okay. But the Gemara says, I don't understand. But ma'yaskinon, and really before the b'mayaskinon, you need a little bit of an introduction. An introduction of mitzias, about the way things were once upon a time. Once upon a time, in the Yiddish shtetl, all the butchers were Jews. All the butchers were sheichtim. And really, because of the fact that all the butchers were sheichtim, it really brought about a tremendous kula. And that is, you're allowed to walk into the shuk, technically, even from a non-Jew, buy meat. Because you know for sure all the butchers were Jews, so they all had a kosher shechita. And really the only thing you'd have to worry about was maybe there was a little bit of a slip-up. At the time of the shechita, maybe the sheichit messed up with one of the 5 halachas l'Moshe Sinai. Or maybe it was a treifa. But being that roiv animals are not treifas, and the thought that maybe the butcher messed up in the shechita, that's not so reasonable. So as a result, the halacha it was that based on the Ikar Adin, you were able to walk into the shuk. It didn't matter who was selling the meat to you, it was going to be okay. stating that, the Chacham waved a hand, the Chacham made a takana. Chacham said, I don't want you to buy meat from a non-Jew. He said, why not? All the butchers are Jews. He said, sure, the butchers are Jews, but you never know. And there is a small possibility that maybe this non-Jew that's selling the meat to you, he wanted to improve his margins a little bit. So what he decided was he started doing his own shchitas. And even though it's not so likely, and from a roiv miyat standpoint, it really, you can go bus a roiv and assume that's not what happened. But the Chachamim said, I'm starting to get a little uncomfortable. Because really, even if you have a Jewish butcher, you know there's always a meat of animals that are treifas, without a question. So take the meat of animals that treifas and the meat of oivdei kechavim that maybe would do their own shchita. You mitzaref the two miyutim, and the chachamim said, even though midday rice, you still have a roiv, but midrabanan, it's not okay. You can't go ahead and buy meat from a non-Jew in the shuk. And this posed a little bit of a challenge. It was inconvenient. So what the chacham did was, or the askanim, they decided that we need to address this takanas chachamim, and they had the perfect solution. They decided that from now on, anytime there's a treifa, meaning anytime you have a butcher, a kosher shaychid, who shechts an animal, and he has an animal that's a treifa. They're going to make an announcement in the shuk that today there was a treifa. Now, for some reason, the assumption is that if there was a treifa today, there's no chashash that it would be sold tomorrow. So the day that the treifa was found, that's the day that it's going to be sold. So they decided we're going to make an announcement that today there was a treifa, and they had some code of exactly the way they made the announcement. If we have time, we're going to get to it in the end of Amud Beis. But the Gemara says that they would make this announcement, and once they made this announcement, the Yidden knew that today you have to worry. What's the reason you shouldn't be able to buy from a guy? Because of the two miyutim. There's a miyut of treifas. So even if you had a good haimish shoichet, there is a miyut of treifas. And number two, if you're buying it from a guy, maybe he shachted it in his backyard, even though we don't know as being a licensed butcher, but it could be he did it anyways. So the two miyutim, you have to be concerned. But once we alleviate one of the two miyutim, so now there's no reason anymore to have a chash d'rabbanan. So that's what the Askanim did. They decided that we're going to make this announcement, and if we make this announcement, and the Chachamim accepted it. They said, yeah, got it. They bought it. They said if you make an announcement and anytime there's a treifa, you let it be known. So as long as you're buying it on a day where they didn't make this announcement, if it's a mokum shemachrizin, that would be enough to allow you to go ahead and to buy it now from a guy. But there were places where they didn't accept this minhag, and places where they didn't make those announcements, the takanas chachamim was in effect, which was you're not allowed to buy from non-Jews. So the bottom line is this: there were two kreisen in Klal Yisrael. There were two types of shtetach. There was a shtetach where you were allowed to buy meat from a non-Jew, and there was shtetach where you were not allowed to buy meat from a non-Jew. Midday rice, you should have always been able to, because midday rice, you were allowed to rely on a roiv. The metzias was all the butchers were Jews. If that wouldn't be the metzias, it would be a whole different conversation. But we're accepting that that's the way it was. So, being that all the butchers were Jews, midday rice, you were always allowed to assume that most meat in circulation was kosher meat, called the parish, you really didn't have to worry about anything. Stating that, the Rabbanon were concerned. So the way to circumvent the Rabbanon's concern was to make an announcement. If you announce every time there's a treifa, then if there was no announcement, you can go ahead and you could buy it with the assumption that there are no treifas in circulation. So the b'makom shemachrizin, a place where they would make the announcement, it was okay to buy meat on a day that they didn't make that announcement. Or on a b'makom she'em machrizin, in a place where they didn't make the announcement, over there it was not okay because it is the takanas chachamim to buy meat. We're discussing a different shiloh. We're discussing selling meat to a guy or giving meat to a guy. So what would be the concern? At first glance, the concern would be if you're going to sell meat to a guy, the guy may go ahead and sell it to a yid. But the truth is, whether or not that should be an issue should depend on whether it's okay to buy meat from a guy. Right? If you're allowed to buy meat from a guy, then it should not be okay to sell meat to a guy. Because there may be a michshol. It may lead indirectly to a lifnei yiver. I'm going to sell it to the guy who's going to sell it to the yid. But if the yid's anyways not allowed to buy it from the guy, so what's the concern? I'm going to sell it to a guy and he's going to sell it to a yid. He's not allowed to sell it to a yid. Or the yid's not allowed to buy it from him. So there's no concern. So there's an inverse relationship with regards to whether I can sell it to a guy and whether the yid can buy it from a guy. If a yid can buy from a guy, then it should be also for the yid to sell to a guy. If a yid is not allowed to buy from a guy, then it should be mutter for a yid to sell to a guy. Now, what did our Mishnah say? Our Mishnah said that if you want to sell the hindquarters of the animal with the gidanosha is, you want to sell it, and what it depends on, is it a yerech shleima or is it a yerech hatucha? Yerech shleima, there you don't have to be worried. Nothing's going to come from it because you'll know if the gidanosha is there or not. If it's hatucha, it's chopped up already, how are you going to know if the gidanosha was removed or not removed? For Gemara, why is the tliya in the Mishnah whether it's shleima or hatucha? chatucha. Really what it should depend on is whether it's a makom shemachrizin or a makom she'ein machrizin. Because if it's a makom shemachrizin, which means that you're allowed to buy from a guy, then it should be also to sell it. It doesn't matter if it's chatucha or shleima. And if it's a makom she'ein machrizin, which means that you're not allowed to buy from a guy, then it should be mutter to sell it. Again, it doesn't matter if it's a chatucha or if it's a shleima. So either way, a little bit of a long-winded introduction, but it's really a big part of today's daf. The beginning of the daf, and then again the whole Lamed Beis. Either way, so Zok the Gemara b'mayaskin. Are we talking about it a makom she'ein machrizin? And if it's a makom she'ein machrizin, means you're not allowed to buy from a guy. So if that's the case, you should be allowed to sell it to him. Chatucha nami l'shadulei. You should be able to sell it to him even if it's chatucha. Because nothing's going to come from him. No one's buying it from him anyways. We're talking about a makom she'ein machrizin, where you're allowed to buy from a guy. Thus the chashash, shleima nami l'shadulei. Then you shouldn't even be able to sell it to him shleima. And the reason is, what do you mean? You're going to tell me it's a makom she'ein machrizin, so you're allowed to buy from a guy. So why should it not be okay to sell him a shleima? Don't you think by the shleima it's going to be nicker? Mar says, yeah, it's nicker if the guy doesn't chop it up. But the chatachlei masmalei, you sold it to him shleima, doesn't mean he's going to sell it shleima. So why aren't you concerned that he's going to chop it up? So the Gemara says three terutzim. Iba yisayim b'makom she'ein machrizin, iba yisayim b'makom she'ein machrizin. Iba yisayim, you can say the Mishnah is talking about makom she'ein machrizin. It's talking about a place where it's machrizin. If it's machrizin, really you're allowed to buy from a guy. If you're allowed to buy from a guy, it should be usher to sell to a guy. Right? It's the inverse. If you could buy it, you can't sell it. So you're allowed to buy. Being that you're allowed to buy, it should be usher to sell. What's the kasha? If it's usher to sell, I understand why you can't sell it chopped up. But why can you sell it shleima? You shouldn't be able to sell it shleima either. What do you mean? There's no chash. The yid will see. That he'll always see if the guy sells it to him shleima. Why are you concerned that the guy's going to cut it up? So the Gemara says, the guy used to chop it up differently than the way the yid used to chop it up. See, a yid would chop up the yerech in a way that it was easy for him to remove the gidanasha. So he would chop it along its length. The guy doesn't care about the gidanasha. So there's a siman muvak. When you buy a piece of meat, you can know whether it was chopped by a yid or by a guy. Thus, you would be able to know whether it was sold in a state of chatucha or sold in a state of shleim. You buy your same, you could say makom she'ein machrizin. Really, the Mishnah is talking about b'makom she'ein machrizin, which means it's also to buy from a guy. If it's also to buy from a guy, then what's the problem to sell it? Give him even the chatucha. Why does the Mishnah say only the yerech shleim you're allowed to give the guy? You should be able to give him the chatucha as well. The Gemara says gzeira shema yitnenu leibefnei Yisrael lacher. It's a new chashash. The chashash is we're afraid that maybe somebody's going to see you giving this yerech to a guy, a yid. He's going to be walking by as this transaction is happening. And he's going to assume for sure it's kosher. And that there's no gir nasha there. Because he's a yid handling in meat. He's probably handling in kosher meat. So he's going to think for sure that there's no gir nasha there. And he may go ahead and buy it from a guy. So you're right. This is not a big macro concern. Because if you look at it from a high level, you're not allowed to buy meat from a guy. But makom she'ein machrizin. So there's no real concern that he's going to resell it in his butcher store. But there is a more specific concern that maybe punk the yidl is going to be walking by as this happened, and he's going to think, oh, there's a kosher piece of meat that he's going to buy it from a guy. So because of this new chashash, the Chachamim said, don't sell. The Gemara says, could be you could say a third teretz. So the first two were rather technical. The third one is very interesting, and it's so interesting that the Gemara is going to digress with it for an amud, and it's something that has ripple effects in halacha. It's something that we're all familiar with, but what we probably didn't realize is that the makar to this halacha, again, that we're all familiar with, so some suspense and foreshadowing, is tucked away right here. Chulin tzadik daled amud aleph. What's the third teretz of the Gemara? Coming to explain a very technical one-line Mishnah in Chulin Tzadik Gimel Amid Beis, a Perikid Anasha. The answer is Mishum de Kagan of Leila Daite. There's a whole different concern. The reason that you're not allowed to sell him, you're not allowed to give him chatucha that has Gidanasha in it, because when the guy takes the meat from the yid, he is going to take it with the assumption that it's kosher. Because again, a yid usually handles in kosher meat. If it's going to have gid hanasha inside of it, you're fooling the guy. You're fooling him. He thinks it's kosher, right? And now it turns out that really it wasn't. You're going to be goinev das of the guy. You're violating the Isser Genevas Das. And it's because of the Isser Genevas Das that the Chachamim said a shleima, there's no Genevas Das. You see exactly what's going on. The chatucha, you don't see what's going on. The guy for sure thinks you're giving him a kosher piece of meat. Kosher means there's no gedanasha. Now, there really is a Gedanasha? There's no problem. There's no michshol. We're going by Makom Shem Machrizin. You're not allowed to buy meat from a guy, so he's not reselling it to any Jews. He has no koinim that are Jews. No Haimish Yid is walking into this guy's butcher shop and buying meat from him. There's no lifnei evil to michshol. You know what the problem is? You're fooling the guy, and that's not okay. How do you know that? The Amash Shmuel said it. Also, there's an Isuk Nevis Das Va'afilu Daita Shel Evi Kechavim. Even a guy says the Gemara of Shmuel, even though this is quoted in the name of Shmuel, Shmuel never really said it, but it was something that was inferred from a Maisa Shahaya Kachaya. Shmuel was once crossing a river, and he was on a ferry. So he told this Gabbai, go give him a tip. So the Gemara says, he tipped him, and Shmuel was disappointed. Says the Gemara, my time why was he upset? Abai says, I'll tell you the rest of the story. You know why? Because this Gabba gave the sailor, who was not Jewish, a tarnagoylis that was a treifa. And he wanted him, Shmuel thought, that he was going to give him a shchuta. So Shmuel was disappointed in the fact that he gave him a tarnagoylis that was a treifa, and not what he thought he was going to give him, which was a tarnagoylis to shchuta. Rava said, Rava said the story was a little bit different. That what happened was Shmuel told the Gabbai what to tip him. He said, give him wine. But he told him, give him wine that's anpaka, undiluted wine, which was more chashiv. By the way, there's so many members in Shas. We always speak this out with Rava and wine. It's very interesting. So Rava said, anpaka. No, he wanted to give him undiluted wine, and instead what he did was, leave that for the historians, he gave him diluted wine, and that's why he was disappointed. He gave him chamra maziga. So the Gemara says, it sounds like it wasn't clear that although Shmuel was disappointed, he was disappointed because of Gnei Das. Again, why are we bringing Shmuel? The Gemara says that Shmuel held that you're not allowed to be Goin of Das. There's an Isser Gnei Das, even from a non-Jew. And you're supposed to see it in this story, but it's not mefurish in this story. Where do you see it in this story? You see it because it seems that this Gabbai who was tipping the sailor didn't do exactly what Shmuel wanted him to do. And Shmuel seemed to think that he was fooling the sailor, and it bothered him that he was fooling the sailor. He's giving him a tarnagoylis under the pretense, under the premise that this is a kosher tarnagoylis, and really it's a tarnagoylis that's a treifa. He's giving him wine under the premise that it's undiluted wine. He thinks it's 18 years old, and it turns out, he poured out the 18-year-old and he replaced it with the 12-year-old. Right? There's an element of Gnei Das. But if that's the case, then it wouldn't be just inferred from the Maisa that Shmuel holds as an Issa Gnei Das when it comes to Eved Kechavim. It would be pretty clear. And the Gemara says it's only inferred. So the Gemara says, why? Why is it only the Chibur Chlalam Mai? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Because it could be there's another reason that Shmuel was upset. Something muchach. Shmuel never said he's upset because of Gnei Das. The assumption is that that's why he was upset. But it could be there were other reasons why he was upset. According to Mandam, that says that what happened was he gave him a tarnagoylis treifa. I can tell you why Shmuel might have been upset. He said, why do you have a tarnagoylis treifa? His Gabba is walking around with a tarnagoylis treifa. He was very upset at him. According to Mandam, that says that he gave him the diluted wine instead of the anpaka. He was just upset at him, not because of the fact that he fooled the person, but because he didn't listen to him. He said, I asked you to tip 18%, you tipped 15% or 12%, right? He was pashut upset that he didn't follow what he had asked him to do, not necessarily upset because of the Gnei Das issue. But regardless, even though there were two ways apparently to interpret whatever happened, and there were even two versions of what exactly the story was. So we have two versions of the story and two possible interpretations of the story, regardless of what the version of the story is. The Gemara comes out and says, Amar Shmuel, Asr Lignev Das Abriyos, it's Asr to be going to Das Abriyos, Va'afilu Daita Shaloiv Dekechab. What does it have to do with Perakid Anasha? That's the third pshat. That's the Ibayis Ema of what the Mishnah could be referring to, that the reason it's not okay to take a cut up thigh that has Gid Anasha and give it to your non-Jew is because the non-Jew for sure thinks you're giving him kosher meat, and if you give him non-kosher meat, it comes out you're being over the Isser Gnei Das. You say, what do you mean? He's not a Yid. You're right, but Shmuel said, also lignev das abriyos va'afilu daitoi shel oivdei kechavim. And on that note, a little bit of a light digression. Tanya, Rameir said, Al Yisari Vadam L'Chaver. Listen, that's like a person shouldn't invite his friend over to his house if he knows for sure he's not going to come. So really, you wouldn't send him the invitation, but he's not going to show up anyway. So you might as well be a nice guy. You might as well send it to him. So that's this halacha right here. You shouldn't try to give him a gift if you know for sure that this person is the type of person that doesn't accept gifts. So don't push him and pester him. Take it, because you know that he's not going to accept it anyways. It could be in your mind you don't really plan on giving it to him, but you're making him think that you were going to give it to him, so you're being going of daita. You're fooling him. That's not okay. So apparently, once upon a time, so we're learning a lot of sociological history today, sociology. So once upon a time, there was this custom that if a chashva person would come to your house, so you would open up a new barrel of wine. And really, the reason it was a chashivos is because a lot of wine was stored in this one cask, this one barrel, and there could be a tremendous hefsed. So what happens if somebody comes to your house and really the person's not so chashiv, you never open up a barrel for him, but it just so happens that you just cut a deal with your local chenveni that you're going to sell him your wine. So this is a perfect opportunity. He walks into your house, he says, I'm so happy here, look what I'm going to do. I'm going to open up this cask has been sitting here it's aged however many years, and you pour it out to him. So this person thinks, wow, he's so machshav me, but in reality you would have never done it. The only reason you're doing it is because you sold it already. So this is being shipped out. It's going to be bottled tonight. So says the Rameir, this is another example of Gnevas Das. This is not okay. Another Allah. If you have a pach, an empty jug, and you tell, would you like some shemen? You know the person's not going to take oil. And you're praying that he doesn't open it up and look inside. You say, why don't you take some? No, it's good. Take it. If it's empty, that's Gnevas Das. Here we have the first caveat. If it's being done for the person's kavim, you're not doing it for yourself. Meaning, I'm not doing this, I want to look good. I'm doing this, I want to be mechaber him. It's in a public place, let's say, or there are other people that you think he would benefit from if he looked good in their eyes. So you're doing it for the person, for the recipient. So that would be an example where some of the aforementioned would be okay. Says the Gemara, Eini, is that true? Ul was once by Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Yehuda opened up for him a new barrel of wine. Now this barrel had already been, he had earmarked it, he was going to sell it to the Chenveni. So we just said that's not okay. Wasn't that one of the examples where it's not where it's considered Gnevas Das? So the Gemara gives two terutzim. One teretz says either he notified him, he told him, he said he didn't fool him. He didn't fool Ula, Rabbi Yehuda. He said, I have barrels of wine, I'm selling it to the Chenveni, but why don't we just open it now? The Ibaya say Meshani, Ula is different. The Chavav Leila Rabbi Yehuda, because we so Chavav to Rabbi Yehuda, so even though it's true, he was only opening something that was already destined to be sold to the Chenveni, but being that it was Ula, who was so Chavav to Rabbi Yehuda, he would have done it anyways. So being that he would have done it anyways, so again, this seems to be the second caveat. We have a few carve-outs here of maybe where it's going to be okay. Another Allah. So once upon a time, in a base oval, they would drink a lot of wine. Right? But there was a lot of wine. It says the Braisa, you're not allowed to go to a base oval and bring a bottle of wine. Looks like it's full, but really it's not full. Additionally, you're not allowed to fill it up with water. Oldest trick in the book. Because you're fooling him. If, however, there's a chashav tzibur, and you're doing it to be menachem the avelim, because you want the avelim to feel good and they're going to look good if a shiny Yid walks in with a shiny bottle. So, in that case, maybe it's going to be okay. You're not allowed to sell to your friend a sandal, shoes, that were made from the hide of an animal that died on its own. Under the premise that really it's from the hide of an animal that was a healthy animal that had shchita. So it's a Gnevas Das type of halacha. What you're doing is you're selling a sandal shel mesa under the guise that it's really the sandal of a shchuta. Why? Well, why is this even an issue? You have to know the history of the animal, from where the hide came, where, says the Gemara, there's two reasons. Number one, you're fooling him. By the way, forget the whole Gnevas Das issue, there happens to be a sakana element as well. So Rashi says the sakana is that maybe the animal died from some infection or something that's really contagious, and it was in the hide, which went into the shoe, which went into the person's foot. So it seems very, very far-fetched, but at the same time, sometimes the Chachamim thought the unthinkable, And in this case, this is something that you need to be concerned about. You shouldn't send to your friend a chaver shel yayin and put a little bit of oil on top, so that it should look like you're giving him oil and not giving him wine. So you think wine is more chashuv than oil, but you want the wine floating on top, so it should look like it's oil when really it's wine. You're going to fool him. Says the Gemara, there was a story. With this exact thing happened. Somebody sent his friend wine and there was a little bit of oil on top. The person thought he had oil. So you know what he did? He invited guests over. Thought he has this big barrel of oil and we're going to have what to dip our pitas into, and it was perfect. And they all came to eat. Matzah, they opened it up, they poured it out, and there was a lot to drink. But there was nothing to eat. Shishal yayin. And the Gemara says this Balabayas, the Balachsanya, was so distraught by what happened, he choked himself. The Eina Archan, says the Gemara, Rasham litem imachal l'feim. A similar halacha, if you're a guest in somebody's house, so you're a guest in somebody's house, you can't start feeding you can't tell people what to eat, and right, some guests, they make themselves very at home. But you're not allowed to do that, so you can take your shoes off, but this you can't do. So you can't go in and start telling the Balabayas, his kids, why don't you come? Why don't you eat a little bit? You're a guest, you sit, whatever they give you, you come, like Balabayas, I say. But if you're the guest, you can't, again, what you're not allowed to do, this is the Kiddush, even tell the Balabayas, his kids, that why don't you come join us? Your own kids, forget about it. We're talking about the Balabayas' kids. Even that's not okay. So unless they get permission. Says the Gemara, there was a story, a very tragic story. Somebody invited 3 guests, it was during a hungry year. All he had was 3 eggs. That was the whole meal. So the Orchim are sitting, and the son of the Balabayas came. Not al echad mehem. He took his chelik, and he gave it to his son. And then the second son and the third son came. So the guests ended up taking the eggs, and they gave it to the 3 kids. But the father of the kid came. He saw that he had 1 egg. There was 1 son. So he had this 1 egg in his mouth, and the other 2 were in his 2 hands. The guests had given the son their eggs. And the kid had taken the 3 eggs. Said the Gemara says, the father was so upset at the kid. Why are you taking the eggs away from the ark? Now he didn't take anything. They gave it to him. But he was so mad at him that he hit him, and he died. When the mother saw what happened to her son, and that her husband killed her son, also the gag, she went to the roof, v'nafla umesa. She jumped off the roof and she died. And when the father saw what happened to his son and to his wife, afu ala lagag, he too went up to the roof, v'nafla umesa, and he died. Amar Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov said, Al davar zen nergu gimel nefashis mi Yisrael. Because of this one little seeming violation of an Issa d'Rabbanan, because of this, 3 nefashis mi Yisrael were killed. Wait, it's up to Gemara. My Kamashwan, what is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov coming to add? I mean, the Brisa was pretty self-explanatory. The Brisa said you're not allowed to do this, and then the Brisa says Maisa Shahaya, where 3 people died. So the Gemara, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Al Dover Zen Nergo Gimel Nefashis Miyisrael. And really, if you want to add a little oomph to the kasha, we know Mishnasa Shel Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is kavan. There's very little kavanaki. Kav means there's very little Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov in Shas v'naki, but everything he said was so refined and precise. That's why the halacha was always like Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. So here you have Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov saying something that seems to be obvious. I mean, everything he said seems to be rather self-explanatory. So the Gemara says, you're right, but you know why we mentioned it? To tell us the Kul Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Because up until that last line, we didn't know who the author of the Brisa was. Kamash Malan, you know who said this? This is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Why does it matter? It's Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. So Pasha, because like we just said, Mishnasa Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is Kavanaki. The halach is always like Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Being that the halach is always like Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, so this is not just a Brisa. Right, there are Brises and there are Brises. This is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Oh, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is Kavanaki. So not only do we have a story with a tragic ending and an interesting halacha midrabanan, albeit, but it doesn't matter. This is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, and a Mishnah says Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov needs to be treated differently because Mishnah says Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is Kavanaki. The only thing is, the one ha'ara, in light of all the raid we spoke out of Masachtes Menachos, I think it was Daf Samach Aleph, is that when we say Mishnah Seish Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Kavanok, is it only Mishnah Seish Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov? What about a Brisa of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov? This is a Brisa. This is not a Mishnah. Okay, it's for Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Either way, it's up to Gemara Vaita. Tanu Rabbanan. So the Gemara is going to return to the original sugya, Makam Shemachrizin, Makam She'im Machrizin, selling a Yerech shleima or chatucha to a non-Jew when there's gid hanasha inside, based on a cheshash that the non-Jew may resell it, then the Gemara is going to come back to Genevas Das, and then we'll speak out a little bit on Genevas Das, but another intense Amid Gemara. Tanu Rabbanon, Hashlei Yach Yerech L'Chaveira. If somebody sells a Yerech to his friend, Shleima, if it's a complete Yerech, Ein Tzarech Shitla Med Gedanasha, he doesn't have to remove the Gedanasha. I mean, there's no halacha that before you send it to him, you have to remove the Gedanasha, because what are you worried about? That the person's going to assume that you get shalach manis, that you think, and there's meat in there, you assume he took out the gid anasha. But in the event that there's no gid anasha, and that he didn't take out, you'll know, because you get a fine in FedEx. You'll know what's going on. But says the Gemara Chatucha, if it's chopped up, then tzarich lidon el gid anasha. Then fashteitzach, you have to take out the gid anasha, because if the sender is a yid, you assume for sure there's no gid anasha inside. If, however, you're sending it to a non-Jew, chatucha, ben shleima, ein tzarech lital himene gedanasha. You do not have to remove the gedanasha. So if you're selling the yerech to a non-Jew, it doesn't matter if it's chatucha or shleima, you don't have to remove the gedanasha. Now this is in sharp contrast to what the Mishnah said. What did the Mishnah say? Hashilech, shelech adam yerech levi kechavim, shegid anasha b'soicham mibnei shemakoy minikar. And the Gemara was medayik. It sounds like mibnei shemakoy minikar. We're talking about a complete yerech, shleima in chatucha loy. And we had three pshatim to understand the difference between shleima and chatucha and what exactly the Mishnah is discussing. So here we have a brisa that contradicts the Mishnah. If you're sending a yerech to an ovi kechavim, it doesn't matter ben chatucha or shleima ein tzarich lital and you're allowed to give it to him with the Gadanash inside. So the Gemara is going to talk about. Nei beis dvarim amru, another halach. Ein moichen nevelos u'treifes avkichab. You're not allowed to sell nevelos u'treifes to a guy. Echad mipnei shemateu. Number one, because you're fooling him. What do you mean you're fooling him? Genevas das. Same third ipa yasema in the previous Gemara. A guy gets meat from a yid, he thinks it's kosher meat. He thinks it's on the higher standard of kosher meat. It turns out it's really not. The echad, additionally, Shem Yachsev in Keren Yisrael Acher. There's a chashash that he may go ahead and sell. Now, if you think about it for a second, just to pause, the first halach and the second halach seem to contradict each other. So when it comes to a guy, you're allowed to give him meat, even with the gedanasha inside. It doesn't matter if it's shleim chatucha, ein tzarich litan le'menu gedanasha. At first glance, because there's no concern that he's going to resell it. I mean, that's what it sounds like. And then, in the next breath, you're not allowed to give him the veils and treifes. Two reasons. The second reason is because we are concerned that he may resell it. So the Gemara again will address all this. And a third halacha, a person is not allowed to tell a guy, kachli bedinar zer basar, buy, here's a dinar and go buy meat for me. That this seems pretty okay, right? You tell him, go to your local butcher shop, here you have a few dollars, and go buy me a piece of meat. So what's the problem? The reason is that they based for number one, Rashi says that the Oivdei Kechavim are sometimes becheskas that they don't pay. So Pasha, we feel bad for the butcher. Butcher's going to give it to the non-Jew, and then the non-Jew is going to say, joke's on you, I'm not giving you the money. So number one, mepnei anas, and the echad shema moichlin nevelos u'treifes. Then there's a more yeridei chashash that if a non-Jew walks into a butcher shop, the Meicher Yisrael may think the non-Jew is buying it for himself. So he may say, oh, perfect, I had this nevelos and treifes, I didn't even know what to do with it. Oh, a non-Jew just walked in, I'm going to give him my non-kosher piece of meat. Little does he know that this non-Jew is really buying it for his Haimish boss, and it turns out he's going to be Mashal Yisrael. Some of the based Dvarim, the halacha is that this is not okay. Either way, so the Brisa said 4 halachas. One discussed selling a yerech to a yid, and then there were 3 halachas that discuss selling meat or buying meat in the context of a Jew and a non-Jew. The Gemara now is going to analyze the latter 3 cases of the Brisa. Again, what were the 3 cases? The first one was that if you want to give a yerech of an animal to a non-Jew, you can give it to him, and you do not have to remove the gidanasha. Doesn't matter if it's shleima or if it's chatucha. You ain't tzarich litel amed gidanasha, which is in contrast to what the Mishnah said. But that's what the first halacha of the Brisa. That's nogeya, what the Gemara is going to discuss now. The next halacha is you're not allowed to sell nevelos treifes to a guy. 2 reasons: Genevas das, and number 2, shema yachzor v'yim turenu Yisrael. We're afraid they may resell. Number 3, which is a big chiddush, is that you're not even allowed to give money to a non-Jew to go buy meat for you. And there's 2 reasons. Number 1, because we're looking out for the butcher. who are afraid that the non-Jew may not pay him. And number two, Shema Moichlin in Veil Setrefis. He may sell him the Veil Setrefis, assuming that the end user is going to be the non-Jew. Regarding the first of the latter three halachas, you don't have to remove the Gedan Asha. But Mayaskin, what are we talking about? Going back to the beginning of the daf, are we talking about a place where they would announce if there was Nevelis and Trefus? Therefore, again, we're not going to chazer over that hakdama. Therefore, it's mutter to buy. It's mutter, therefore, to buy meat from a non-Jew, because if there were ever a treifa, they would make the announcement. Thus, you're allowed to buy meat from a non-Jew. If you're allowed to buy meat from a non-Jew, why is it okay then to give the non-Jew a yerech chatucha that has gedanosha in it? Chatucha may ain't tzarich l'tilim at gedanosha. Kivon doloi achris. Why aren't you concerned that a yid's going to go ahead and buy? So shleima is not a problem, like the Mishnah said, because shleima is always noticeable. So no concern, no takal is coming from a yerech shleima as it relates to Gedan Asha. But as it relates to chatucha, it shouldn't be okay, because being that it's a makash machrizin, so it should be a ela pshita. It's pashit that case of the price is discussing in makash machrizin. It's a place where they didn't make the announcement. So being that they didn't make the announcement, it is usur to buy from a guy. If it's usher to buy from a guy, so then it's mutter to sell to a guy. And even a chatucha, where the Gedan Asha wasn't removed, there's no, what's the concern? That the guy's going to sell it to a yid? He's not going to sell it to a yid, because he may try to, but a yid's not allowed to buy. It's halacha. There's a takanas chachamim in b'makom shem achrizin, a yid's not allowed to buy from a guy. So it's pashit, says the Gemara. Ela pshita, right? Sometimes the Gemara says it as pshita. It's pashit. It's self-evident that with this ili b'makom shem achrizin, that case is discussing a place where it's usher to buy meat from a guy. If it's usher to buy meat from a guy, that's why it's mutter to give him the yerech chatucha with the Gedan Asha. But the Gemara says, "Ein mitziyasa." Look at the next case. There's two reasons you're not allowed to sell nevel trevis to a guy. The second reason is because he may resell to a yid. But if we're talking about a place then a yid's not allowed to buy from the guy anyway. So why can't you sell him the veil trevis? That's the stira we spoke out when we went through the price in real time. So you're allowed to give him the yerech chatucha with the Gedan Asha inside, because there's no concern he's going to sell to a guy, because to a yid, because it's b'makom shem achrizin, he's not allowed to buy it from him anyways. But at the same time, you can't give him the nevelis treifis because we're afraid he's going to resell it. Manavshach. If we're dealing at a makom shem achrizin, you have nothing to worry about. Ela pshita, says the Gemara. It's pashit. It's pashit. The makom shem achrizin. The only way to understand it is a makom shem achrizin where a yid's allowed to buy from a guy. So if he's allowed to buy from a guy, you can't now give the guy the nevelis treifis. Mar says, let's learn the last halacha. You're not allowed to give a guy money to go buy meat for you, and for two reasons. Number one, he may not pay the butcher, so we feel bad for the butcher, and number two, the butcher may sell this guy in the Veil Treifis thinking that he's eating it for himself, not knowing that it's really going to his boss. In fact, if we're talking about then what are you worried about? If in fact the butcher has a treifa and he's going to give it now to the guy, then there would have been a hachrasa. So what are you worried about? You're worried that maybe there's a treifa and he's going to give it to the guy? If you live in a makom shemachriz, that means you can't just have a treifa. If you have a treifa, there's a whole announcement, there's pashkavilin. It's a big deal. It stops traffic when there's a treifa. That's the way it is. You have to make a big fuss about it. That's the only reason you're allowed to buy meat from a guy. This was something that the shtetl felt was worthwhile for them. It was worth it for them to go through the hassle and announce the treifas like this. You'd be able to buy meat from non-Jews also. But the point is that to the extent that we're living in a makom shemachrizin, then this whole concern is a moot point. What are you worried about? Maybe he sold him a treifa and you wouldn't know about it. All you need to know is that there was no achraz, that there's a treifa. And everything is pshita, says the Gemara, makom she'em machrizin. The third case is makom she'em machrizin. So says the Gemara, do the math. Reisha v'seif makom she'em machrizin. The first and the last case we said was makom she'em machrizin. Mitziyasa v'makom she'em machrizin. Does that make sense? Amar Abaye in Reisha v'seif makom she'em machrizin. Mitziyasa makom she'em machrizin. The Reisha is makom she'em machrizin. The Seif is a makom she'em machrizin. The middle case was makom she'em machrizin. Even though it's a little dachuk, you have one brisa that says three halachos that relate to different shtetloch, right? This is referring to this shtetl, this is talking about that shtetl, this is going back to the original shtetl. It's a little dachuk. But Abaye said the brisa has to reconcile, has to make sense, and this is the only way to make a word. Rava said a different teretz. Kula b'makom shemachrizin. Really, the whole brisa is discussing a makom shemachrizin. So if the whole Bryce is talking about a Makash Machrizin, we understand the middle case. What was the middle case? The middle case was where you're not allowed to sell Nevelos or Trevis to a guy. It's b'makom shemachrizin. Being that it's makom shemachrizin, you're allowed to buy from a guy. That's why you're not allowed to sell to a guy. The problem is, if we're talking about a makom shemachrizin, how do you understand the Reisha and the Seifa? The Reisha said that you're not allowed, that it's okay to sell a yerech hatucha to a guy. What was the assumption? Because he can't sell it anyways. It's not true. If it's a makom shemachrizin, then he could sell it because a yid's going to buy from him, and the Seifa as well. We proved it's talking about makom shemachrizin. So Rava came with a new knech. Rava said, "You're right. The Reish and the Seifa are talking about makom shemachrizin, but it's talking about shehechrizu geshmak. It's talking about where they actually made the hachraza. Being that they made the hachraza, you're weiter not allowed to buy it from a guy. Because what's the whole point of the hachraza? Beware. Today, don't buy from an anj. That was the whole purpose of the hachraza. So you're right. Ordinarily, b'makom shemachrizin, you would be allowed to buy from a guy, but only on a day where there was no hachraza. That's pashit. B'makom shemachrizin, if there was a hachraza, you're not allowed to buy from a guy. So a makom shemachrizin, where they actually made an announcement, it's the equivalent thereof of a makom shemachrizin. So Rava said the Reish and the Seifa, which imply that it's usher to buy from a guy in Nevelos and Treifas, are not talking about b'makom she'ein machrizin where it's always usher. No, it's talking about where really it's mutter. It just so happens today it's usher. Being that today it's usher, so today it's okay to sell the cut up yerech to your guy. What did Rava accomplish? And the middle case has to be talking about where there was no chaz. What did Rava accomplish over what Abaya did? Abaya made the Reish and the Seifa talking about Mokim She'im Machrizin. The Mitziyasa was a Mokim She'im Machrizin, different shteitlach. So the Reish was Kotsk, and then the Mitziyasa was Kozhnitz, and then the Seifa was Kotsk again. Rava didn't like that. Rava didn't want that different parts of the Brisa should be talking about different shteitlach. So he said, no, it's all the same shteitel, and it's all Kotsk, and it's all a Mokim She'im Machrizin. The difference is, this was on a day where they made Achraz, they didn't make Achraz. So Abaya preferred having different shteitlach. Rava wanted to be consistent in terms of what kind of city, what kind of makom the Bryce is talking about, but rather, and he was okay, he was willing to compromise and say, I'll make this like Kimter. Rav Ashi said a third teretz kuv makom she'em machrizin. Really, the whole Bryce is talking about makom she'em machrizin. If the whole Bryce is talking about makom she'em machrizin, we understood the Reish and the Seifa. We didn't understand was the middle case. The middle case is that you're not allowed to sell Nevelos and Trevis to a guy. And the Bryce gave two reasons, the second of which was, what? That we're afraid he may resell it. If it's a makom she'em machrizin, the yid can't buy from a guy anyways. So what's the concern? He may resell it. We're afraid that he may sell it in front of a yid, similar to the chashash that we had earlier. So if he's going to sell it in front of a yid, the yid's going to see him sell it. It's stafka over there that there's a concern. The yid's going to say, I saw the yid sell it to the guy, so probably it's kosher. You're right. Ordinarily, it's not a chashash because the yid can't buy from a guy anyways. But there is a makom to be geyser in case you saw it with your own eyes. A yid did this transaction happen, and it's bekahai gavna that it's going to be a problem. Zok the Gemara vayte heichi machrizina. So we're talking about this makom shemachrizin, makom she'em machrizin. What was the announcement? Yosef said they used to say nafal bisra lebnei chela. The announcement would be that there's meat that's meant for the bnei chela. That's loosely translated, the general populace. Is what we have right now. That was like the code word to know that it's not all kosher, mahadrin, glat, Yosef, etc. meat, but there's meat here that's meant for the general populace, that's in circulation. Don't buy meat today. Why are we talking in code? Why can't we just be clear? Why don't we just say that there's a treifa? So Gemara says because they were afraid then the non-Jews wouldn't buy the meat either. They wanted the non-Jews. I mean, didn't we just learn the sugi mamish in today's staff? We had the sugi of Gneva Stas. So you're telling me that maybe if you would make an announcement that there's treifas in circulation today, even the non-Jews wouldn't buy. So what do? You don't say that there's treifas. You don't say this treifas, and now you're fooling the non-Jews. Why isn't this Gneva Das? The Gemara says, Inuhu de kamati nafshayu. And this is another asterisk on the halach of Gneva Das. And that is that this is a little different. Because you're not telling him that it's kosher when really it's not kosher. You're not even making him believe it's kosher. You're not doing anything. All you're doing is you're making a vague announcement. You could have made a more clear announcement, and instead you chose to make a vague announcement. if the non-Jew wanted, he could have asked, tell me, what exactly does this announcement mean? And then you would have to be honest with him. No one's saying you wouldn't. But to make this vague announcement, that doesn't constitute Gnevas Das. And says the Gemara, this precedence for this Chiddush. Mar Zutra, who was the son of Rav Nachman. So the great Rav Nachman had a son whose name was Mar Zutra. And he was once traveling from Sichra to Bnei Mechuzah, from the two cities. The Rav of Rav Safra have a castle with Sichra. So Rav Mar Zutra, Rav Nachman, is leaving Sichra. He's going towards Mechuzah. Rava is coming from Mechuzah. Rava was the Rav of Mechuzah. Right? So Rava is coming from Mechuzah together with Rav Safra towards Sichra. Pagu Adadi. They met each other. So the Gemara says, who's Saval Api with the Kasi? Mar Zutra thought that Rava heard that Mar Zutra was coming to Mechuzah, and Rava went out to greet him. He thought they brought a whole entourage to go greet him. So, Amar Lahu. So Mar Zutra immediately tells Rav and Rav Safra, you didn't have to be so much shriach. It wasn't necessary for you to come out and greet me like this. Amalei Rav Safra. So Rav Safra told him, "Anad lo yavi yadin the kasimar." So Rav Safra was brutally honest. He said, "I'll tell you the truth. I had no idea that you were coming." He said, "Oh, but by the way, yavi yadinon. Had I known, tvei havi turkey, I would have brought food. We would have came Rava wine, right?" Then he says, "For sure." So to Gemara, Amalei. So Rava told Rav Safra, "My time amrit lehachi." He says, "Why do you have to tell this to him?" I mean, he felt so good. Mar Zutra felt so good about himself. So why would you do this to him? Amalei. So he told him, "I'll tell you why. Because I thought it's Gnevas Das. Isn't there an Issa Gnevas Das?" So Rava said, "That's not Gnevas Das. No, I never did anything. Meaning, we didn't go out, make believe, purposely go to Sichra on the day that we knew that Mar Zutra was going to be coming, so that he should think we didn't do anything to mislead him. He just happened to think something based on an action that we did. Gnevas Das is when you do something, you're proactive on some level in a way that fools somebody into thinking something that didn't really happen. That's not what happened over here. We were doing our own thing. We were traveling from Mechuzah to Sichra, and it just so happens that we met Mar Zutra, and in Mar Zutra's eyes, it seemed like we were being mechaber him. So, but being that we didn't do anything, we're not mechuyev to tell him that's not what happened. Safra held not that way. Either way, so this is another wrinkle to the halachas of Gnevas Das. And it sounds like, for sure, from the Maskanas HaGemara, Rava and the Teretz in the previous Gemara, why they made the announcement in a more vague way, and they weren't forced to say that we have a treifa today, is because even though it's true, there's something called Gnevas Das, and even though Gnevas Das is also even for a Ben Noyach, that's how chomer it is, but at the same time, in the Gemara, it would seem that the only time it's a problem is if you're doing something proactively. So you're walking into a Beis Oval and you have a bottle of wine. So it looks like you be mechaber him, and really it's only half full. Or you take oil, you put it on top of the wine, so it looks like you're giving him oil, or really you're giving him wine. Or any of the aforementioned cases that we had in the many brises and members and Daf Tzadik Dalam and out. But the point is, in all of those cases, Hatzad HaShavah Shalem is that you're actually doing something. But to the extent that you're not doing something, it's not going to be an issue. Regardless, the sugya of Gnevas Das is a Gemara in Masechtas Chulin, Daf Tzadik Aleph, you have it on Amid Aleph, you have it on Amid Beis. This is the makar to the laws of Gnevas Das. And one thing that was clear in the Gemara, that there's an Issa Gnevas Das, and that the Issa Gnevas Das is even for a Benayach. I think it's kedai to just speak out a little bit of background, just to have a little bit of a better appreciation as it relates to Gnevas Das, but specifically with an Akvam. And that is the Rambam in the beginning of Hilchos Geneva. So this is literally chapter 1, verse 1. Perek Aleph, Halacha Aleph, Hilchos Geneva. Says the Rambam, Kol hagoynim mamoin, mishava pruta u'mayil. If somebody steals money, shava pruta and higher, oivra loisa say, oivra loisa say, shenema loisa gnoivu. Ve'in loikin alav say, there's no malchus for loisa gnoivu, shari nitin l'tashlumen. Shahaganev chayva oisa toyer l'shalom. If somebody steals, it's nitin l'tashlumen, and a loisa say that's nitin l'tashlumen. The Rambam in Hilchos Gezela says nitin laseh. Here he doesn't say nitin laseh. He says nitin tashlumin. A lot of raid in Bava Kama. But the point is, there's no malchus for the lav of Geneva. Says the Rambam. It doesn't matter if you steal money from a yid. Oh yeah, goy mom goy oiver avodah zara. Or even if you steal from a guy, but not just a guy, a pagan oiver avodah zara. Or if you steal from a gadol, or you think maybe he's a katan, it's different. It doesn't matter. It's Geneva dairaisa, and you're over aloisa say shenemar loy sig noivo. The Rambam in Hilchos Geneva, Perek Zayin, Halacha Ches, is discussing the halachos of mishkolos. Perik Zayin Halacha Aleph. Hashoikel lechaveiro b'mishkolos chaseros min hamishkol sheskimu olav bnei oisa hamedina. So if somebody weighs and he uses improper weights, oya hamoidit b'dima chasero, oya hamida sheskimu olav, hareza over b'loisase, shenema loisasu ovel b'mishpat, b'mida, b'mishkol, b'msurah, psukim and parashas Kiseitze, everyone knows this halacha, that you're not allowed to use false weight. Says the Rambam in Halacha Ches, Echad hanoisim v'noisim in Yisrael. It doesn't matter if this person who used these improper weights was handling with a yid, or magoy, or yvid avodah zarah, or with a non-Jew that's an oived avodah zarah. Imadad, or shokal bechaser, oived beloisase. He's over beloisase, the chayiv lahachser, and he's going to have to give it back. Says the Maggid Mishnah. How did the Rambam know that the iser mishkoilos, chaserois, and mida mishkol, and how do you know it relates to a non-Jew also? Maybe it only relates to a Jew. Says the Maggid Mishnah, the Rambam held it was pashut. He said because if someone's over the iser mishkoilos, he's a gav. And Geneva, the Rambam Paskin, the Perak Aleph Halacha Aleph relates, Echad HaGoyim Mami Yisrael, Oy Goy Oived Avodah Zarah. So if Geneva relates to a non-Jew, there's no reason that this halacha should relate to a non-Jew as well. In other words, the Rambam Shita is that Geneva's akum is aser. Not only is it aser, it's aser midei raisa, and it's not a halacha that's tucked away somewhere in Hilchas Geneva. It's right in the beginning of Hilchas Geneva. When the Rambam introduces Geneva, he says, Echad HaGoyim Mami Yisrael, Oy HaGoyim Mami Goy. Just like everybody understands that in the laws of Geneva on a Deiraisa level, it doesn't matter if you steal from a Gadol or a Katan. What's the difference? It doesn't matter if you steal from a Jew or a non-Jew. It's the same exact halacha. And the Rambam says it again in Hilchas Geneva, Perak Zayin Halacha Ches, and the halacha of the Mishkolos, the way the Maggid Mishnah understands it. Incidentally, I was thinking, the Minchas Chinuch speaks out many times that according to the Rambam, if somebody steals, in addition to the Isser Geneva, he's also over Leisachmoid and Leisasava, right? Over Leisachmoid. You're not allowed to covet your friend's thing. So if you go ahead and take somebody's thing, there would be a leisachmai. So would you have leisachmai by Geneva Sakum? But the truth is, Minchas Chinuch speaks it out Mefurish. He says in Mitzvah Lamed Ches, at the very end, after this whole classic arichos on the laws of leisachmai, he says there's for sure no leisachmai when it comes to a non-Jew. Interesting. Why? Because listen to the words of the Aseres Adibros, Parashas Yisrael. Leisachmai beis reyecha. Loisachmoid Eshes Reyecha. Va'avdei va'amasei v'shoyrei v'chamoyrei v'choy l'asher l'rei. It says Reyecha 3 times. We know Reyehu was always memayit oivdei kechavim. So it says it in Chas Chinuch, even though the Rambam Shita is Geneva Zakum is aser, and it relates to Mishkolos and other halachas as well. But Loisachmoid, that piece of Loisachmoid, that you're not going to have by an Eni Yehudi. The Rambam in Hilchas Deyos, Perik Beis Halacha Vav brings the halacha of Geneva Stas. So in Perik Aleph Halacha Aleph Hilchas Geneva, Rambam's talking about the raw halacha of Geneva. Perik Zayin Halacha Ches, the Rambam's discussing being dishonest in business, which is the halacha of the Mishkolos. And in both places, the Rambam says the halacha relates to a yid and to an Eini Yehudi equally. It says the Rambam Hilchas Deyos, v'loisia, I'm skipping, echad bepev echad belev. A person should not be echas bepev echas belev. Toichei gebaroi. The way a person is supposed to conduct himself is bitoichei gebari, v'inyin shebelev hu adav shebepeh. And a person should speak what he feels, meaning don't present yourself one way when really you're somebody else. Then the Rambam says, "V'asur lignoiv das habrios." It's also to be going of das. Afilu das hagoy. Even a non-Jew. Keitzad lo yimkol hagoy basan avela b'chal shchuta arsugya. A person shouldn't sell to a non-Jew basan avela when he's presenting it as Basar Shchuta, even though he's going to say, what's the difference? There's no Lifnei Iver, he's an Eni Yehudi, he's allowed to eat, but it doesn't matter. Geneva Stas. Either way, the Rambam brings many of the examples that were mentioned in our Sugya, and the Rambam concludes, Elisfas Emes, V'ruach Nochain, V'leiv Tahar, Mikol Amor. So it sounds like the Rambam's talking about Madreikas, right? It sounds like you're like in the 14th parak of the Mesilas Yesharim. No, this is halachas. The Rambam says, Aser. So he says, V'aser Lignev Das Abriyos, V'afilu das hagoy. Now, all these halachas are brought down in Shulchan Aruch. The Mechaber is in Siman Sameach, Kiyodua, Siman Shin Mem Ches, in Cheshem Mishba, Kol Hagoyne, V'afilu Shavar Pruta. If somebody sells a Shavar Pruta, I feel over our lab the loisik novel, V'chayv l'shalom. Echad Hagoyne Mamin Yisrael, Oy Hagoyne Mamin Shal Akum. Echad Hagoyne Migadol, Oy Mikot. Says the Ramah, Ta'us Akum. What about Ta'us Akum? Going back to Oisa B'cheshman, can you, let's say you're better in math than the Eini Yehudi that you're doing business with. So can you fool him? Or you're not going to steal from him, you're just not going to repay a loan. Mutter. You just have to make sure it's never going to come to Achil Hashem. V'yeshayim says the Ramah, the Aser la toisa. Yeshayim says no, it's Aser. Elim Tom may atzmei shar. If he himself made a mistake, you don't have to tell him about the mistake he made. But you can't do an action to go ahead and fool. Says the Bir HaGra. What's the makar to the V'yeshayim in the Ramah? The second pshat says the Gra. It's pashit. You know what the pshat is? Because it's afilu gnevas das asru b'chulin daf tzadik dalam and al v'chein pasuk Rambam. It's pasha because if gnevas das is also how could toisakum be also? So everyone knows the sugi of toisakum and it's 2 days in the Ramah. But the bottom line is that the Goyin says that the v'yei shomrim in the Ramah is pasha because if gnevas das akum is also how could tois das akum be also? So again, this is just a little bit of the background just to set the table with the different Rambams and Perak Aleph Alach Aleph, Perak Zayin Alach Ches and Alchas Gneva, Perak Beis Alach Vav and Alchas and the Mechaber and the Ramah and Simon Samech, which is a little bit more complicated. But just to speak out one tshuva, a tshuva from a guy in Rav Moshe Feinstein, Zecher Tzadik Levracha. It's an Igros Moshe. It's Choshen Mishpat Chelik Beis, and it's Simon Lamed. The shaila that was presented to Rav Moshe was apparently, once upon a time, I actually remember this tumult a little bit, is people were stealing the New York State regents. So we don't have these problems in Lakewood. But once upon a or New Jersey, I should say. Once upon a time, people were stealing the New York State regents. And the question was presented to Rav Moshe about the halachic permissibility of high school boys stealing regents to benefit their marks. Says, they were getting the answers. Says Rav Moshe, listen to how the question was presented. It sounded like this was an inside job. The yeshivas were actually behind this. Listen how Rav Moshe goes without this. Number one, every word in this tshuva you give him a dag. It's aser. Loy rak midina de malchusa. Number one is dina de malchusa. You're not allowed to do it. So if the government doesn't allow you to do it, so it's aser right away. But besides for that, it's aser midayraisa without dina de malchusa. Meaning a speeding limit is the dina de malchusa. Doesn't say in the Torah you can't drive more than 65 miles an hour in the Garden State Parkway. So ask your local rabbi about dina de malchusa dina. So number one, dina malchusa dina is an entity unto itself. So you have dina de malchusa. Number two. For sure it's Gnevas Das. Shegam Kenos, Kido Amashmu Bechulun Dav Tzadik Dalim Rav, She'also B'Gnev Das Abriyos. Va'afilu Daita Shalakum. So the Kolshkin Hocha Shu Gnevas Das L'Kuli Am Afli Yisrael. So number one, you have Dina de Malchusa, said Rav Moshe. Number two, you have Gnevas Das. But here says Rav Moshe even worse. You know why? El Dugam Gnevas Dover Mamish. Because what's going to happen? One day this person is going to go on a job interview. And his potential employer is going to ask him, so what's your highest level of education? Did you graduate high school? He's going to say, yeah, he's going to have a high school diploma. But in reality, he doesn't have a high school diploma. He cheated his way through high school. And as a result, his diploma is not real. This person's going to hire him on the das that he's a high school graduate, when in reality, he's not. So it's going to come out that every paycheck that this person deposits, he's a ganef. Because he's taking money that really he has no right to take because this person wanted to hire someone that has a job. Now it's interesting. The person told Rav Moshe, it sounds like in the Shaila, one of the things that was presented to him is that there's an idea in Shas that if someone's makbid on a davar she'enoi tzarich, rashay l'shaker. So let's say you have this, you're stubborn, you're makbid on a certain thing, but you're being silly. Well, why? Who cares? Does it really matter? So it could be such a paid that doesn't have so much value. So he told Rav Moshe that, maybe this is not such an issue. He says, because he thinks it's important that this person have a high school degree in order to get a job. A lot of people that dropped out of high school that made a lot of money, right? So why does it even matter? So Rav Moshe dismissed it. He said, first of all, you're not allowed to lie, which is another reason you can't do this. But he says, besides, I disagree with you 100%. Rav Moshe says, this is not a davar she'ein rashay lahakbid. This is a real thing. There are certainly things, the mishu baki b'lemudei chayil, who yoyse yoydea b'inyane, iskei parnasa, mimasu matan. There's definitely value to a degree, and if someone has an education, there's certain things he'll know how to do that someone who doesn't have a degree won't be able to do. That's for sure it's going to be us. There was another cheshbon. The other cheshbon was, there's so much bittul Torah that's going to come about by studying for the regents. It was a big deal. So if there's so much bittul Torah, right? So maybe because of the cheshbon of bittul Torah, it should be okay to steal the regents. Says Rab Moshe, what, it doesn't say that that Talmud Torah is doicha geneva. So just because you're right, there's a bittul Torah cheshbon, that's not a reason for you to be able to go ahead. See, he says, and elamai, this person, the olam, they're such masmidim, and it's very hard for them. V'nafsham chashke b'Torah. Benanza. They're at the point where you can't get married. I can't. There's a cheshbon, a bittul Torah. Then you know what? Then you shouldn't worry. Then and Ramesh was fine with that. He said, then don't go to high school and don't cheat your way through high school. And Hashem will take care of you. But to go and to sit through the classes, but then cheat your way through because you don't want to study for it, that's not good. And then Ramesh says that's not bittul Torah. He says because these people anyways going to English. Elamai, they don't want to study. So he says it's atzlus ba'alma, kishalayimid ba'oifid shalayleda, ki azmanu al kopanim mevatel. He's anyways wasting time. Va'adarabba, you know what's coming from this? Number one, misragul shalayleda mashalayimid. You're sitting in a class and you're not paying attention. You're training yourself to learn without really having to know what you're learning, which is not a good thing. And not just that, Misragala Atzlus, you're training yourself to be lazy. Either way, Ramosha told him at the end of the tshuva, so it was pretty clear that you're not allowed to steal the regions. But as far as Allah Lamaisa, but then Ramosha said that the people that are spreading these rumors that the yeshivas were behind it, he says, Chas v'sholom, it's not true. And he was very, very upset about it. And he said he thinks a lot of it is kina, because they know that the Bnei Yeshiva, a lot of them excel in their limudei choil, adifim mitalmidim shalom, much better than a lot of the kids that go to, the non-yeshivas, and there's a kina, and there's anti-Semitism, there's a lot of sentiments that are enmeshed in this rumor. So Ramesh should help, don't believe the rumor. But as far as the halachic permissibility, that's something that's definitely not going to be okay. There's another interesting tshuva in Igros Moshe Yardei Chelik Aleph. Maybe we'll save that for next week.